What is of interest to me is to take on big public policy challenges and fix them, to build big infrastructure and get it done. Not just talk about it, but get it done. That's something that when I look back at the years that I was in politics, I can feel some sense of pride because I know that, today as I drive around the province, when I can look at projects that I had a direct role in getting built, and that gives me some sense of satisfaction.
I'm Peter McCully. That's Kevin Falcon, former Deputy Premier, Minister of Transportation, Minister in Finance, who has recently been elected leader of the BC Liberals. Falcon took a break from politics to start a family. Is he the same Kevin Falcon that was first elected 22 years ago? We'll chat when Today in BC continues.
From the latest community news to informative, entertaining reads for travelers and the cannabis curious. Just visit your local Black Press Media community newspaper website to sign up today.
Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Tell us about growing up in West Vancouver.
Well, my parents bought our family home back in 1963 for the grand sum of $28,000. That was back when housing truly was affordable. My dad ran a small business. My mom was a nurse, and they together raised 6 boys at that house. So it was crowded, and times were difficult, frankly, sometimes financially, but that was not unusual in the era in which I grew up. And so, communities worked together, and I may not have felt like I had everything that a kid could want that you see nowadays when kids take for granted new bikes, etc. I never had a new bike in my life. That would have been amazing. But I never felt like I wanted for anything either. My parents were really good at, frankly, looking after us even when times were a little bit tough.
So growing up in a lower income family, as you say, things were tough. I guess you were pretty fortunate to have access to free tuition a little later on down the road.
Yeah, one great thing about Catholic schools, when I went to Vancouver College, which sounds like a college, but it's actually a Catholic high school in Vancouver. It took me 3 buses to get to school because that was a long way from West Vancouver to go to Vancouver. But one thing the school did was, for families like ours, was provide tuition breaks and even free tuition for kids whose families they knew, couldn't afford the tuition. Ours was one of them. And I've never forgotten that. That was something that was pretty amazing. And, to this day, I continue to support Vancouver College. Even though I have 2 girls, I have no boys. It's a boys-only school. So there's not much I can do there in terms of sending my kids. But I still support them because I remember the support they gave me and my brothers. And that was meaningful.
So was it in school where you were first introduced to politics?
Partially. I remember I had a teacher in grade 10 history that brought in a politician to come speak to us. And that was fascinating to me. Ironically, it was an NDP politician. I think the individual was running for the federal NDP, but I, was very naive and everything he said sounded really cool and stuff. So I thought that was great. And I went home and I started reading up things. So that sparked my interest in politics.
In school, we've all made lifelong friends who have gone with us from junior high, high school, university, right through. So did you make some friends with students who would later figure prominently in your political life?
Like in high school, yes. I still have friends from high school that are friends to this day, but they're not so much active in political life. In university, however, when I attended Simon Fraser University, I did sort of run into a network of people there that, over the years, we've all stayed in touch and stayed in politics. So Christy Clark, for example, went to Simon Fraser while I was there. She didn't finish while she was there, but, for the time that she was there with us, she was actively involved in politics. Ryan Beatty, who's a prominent philanthropist today and involved in the business community, also attended while I was there. So there are a number of people that I'm still friends with to this day that attended SFU with me.
It's interesting. Most of the politicians I've met over my life have all had the bug early.
Yeah, it is interesting because, I didn't come from a political family at all. Like, my parents were not involved in politics. They never talked really about politics very much. Occasionally, my father might complain a little bit about, the government or something. But for the most part, there was virtually no directional influence from my parents. And I am the only one in my family, really, that took such a strong interest in politics. And the more I started to read, because I'm a voracious reader, and so the more I started reading biographies of world leaders, the more I started to realize the importance that individuals can make in public policy and helping change the world for better or for worse. And so that's really what intrigued me, is the power of an individual to make a difference, that we all have an obligation in our own unique ways to step forward and make a contribution.
Kevin, could you name 3 people who have been your biggest supporter or mentor or role model over the years?
In terms of a mentor, as far as a person that's directly involved in supporting me, there was a fellow when I was a kid. His sons were very good friends of mine, Bob and John Vickerstaff, and their father, Robert Vickerstaff, really was kind of a mentor in many ways. He would give me advice, encouraged me to be involved in politics, to go and volunteer, to give back to the community, and really help to take that spark of interest that I had in high school and expand that. Then I started watching leaders around the world, and I grew up in an era where Ronald Reagan was president, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of England. You had Bill Bennett in British Columbia as the premier. So I had this amazing front row seat, if you will, to some of the great leaders in history. And, I remember that time, especially while I was going to SFU, so many people hated Reagan and Thatcher, and yet I looked at what they were doing and said, these are people that are standing for really important values, and they're principled politicians, and that's really important to me. And sure enough, the left turned out to be completely wrong. Reagan did bring down communism around the world and ushered in a new era of liberty, freedom, and the importance of democracy, which we see today under assault. And one thing he said in one of his speeches that has always stuck with me, Peter, was the fact that he said, we do not inherit the values of liberty, freedom, and democracy in our bloodstream. It's something that each generation has an obligation to fight and defend. And, you see what's happening today in Ukraine, and you realize, boy, is that ever true. We cannot just assume that what we've inherited is always going to be here. We have an obligation to do our bit to make sure the system works and that people will continue to see its importance.
I've heard you have quite a library of political books, biographies, autobiographies. Any that you've enjoyed more than others and maybe have given you some direction in your life?
Well, I love reading about historical figures. I have a massive library, and my wife is a passionate reader too, although her interests are not in politics. They're more in the arts and philosophy, etc. But we have books all over the place at our house. It's quite funny. But I love reading stories of historical figures, whether it's Henry VIII or Napoleon or, Ronald Reagan or all the U.S. presidents. I read all Bob Woodward's books about the different administrations. I think he's covered at least 9 because he's sort of a fly on the wall in terms of the decision-making processes, especially during really challenging times. And I find that very, very interesting because to me, having the ability to make decisions in the midst of a crisis is one of the most important attributes you can have. And so I think I absorb a lot of that, think about it a lot.
It's often said that public service is a calling. Do you have any fond memories of what you would consider making a difference early in your political career? Something that said, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I actually think as I look around sometimes over the years, I've often wondered why some people run. It just seems to me that a lot of people are just so happy to be elected, and that seems to be their thing. They're just happy to be there. Whereas I always looked at public life in terms of there's a lot of downsides, and they're pretty significant downsides. There's time away from family. For some people, there's a pretty significant income hit. There's the nonsense and the BS you sometimes have to put up with when you're in public life. So there's a lot of downsides. But to me, it was always about knowing that if I can get big things done and I can feel like while I'm there, things are getting accomplished, then it makes it feel like it's been worthwhile to me. I absolutely do not care about being there just to have my name in the paper or be on TV or what have you. I've been there and done all that. It's not of interest to me at all. What is of interest to me is to take on big public policy challenges and fix them, to build big infrastructure and get it done. Not just talk about it, but get it done. That's something that when I look back at the years that I was in politics, I can feel some sense of pride because I know that, today as I drive around the province, when I can look at projects that I had a direct role in getting built, and that gives me some sense of satisfaction.
Along those lines with fixing public policy and whatnot, you were a minister with a reputation for setting a course and getting it done. And I should think that your time as Minister of Health would have had particular meaning to you given the health issues members of your family faced as you were growing up.
Yes, it does. Growing up, I lost a brother to a horseback riding accident when he was in his early 20s. And, Greg was just riding a horse like anyone else up in Kamloops with a couple of my other brothers. I wasn't there at the time. in many ways, I'm happy because it was a traumatic experience for them, but probably they think while they were galloping along, the horse may have gone under a tree branch or something and knocked him off the horse. And he had a severe brain injury and was in the Royal Inland Hospital in critical care for many weeks, and then was ultimately transferred down to Vancouver, and he ultimately passed away. You know, that's a traumatic experience when you grow up in a family of 6. It's a close family. And then my father was struck with a rare disease that's very similar to Parkinson's, but it's a bit worse. It's called Shy-Drager's illness, and it's a degenerative disease that ultimately left him so that he's unable to communicate and had to be fed through a tube. Let me tell you a quick story about that I think is so important when I think about democracy. And whenever I hear people say, oh, I don't give crap, you know, they're all the same, I'm not going to bother voting and stuff. I think about my dad, and they would come in on voting day, and he literally could not speak. And the person would say to him, blink your eyes once if this is the person you want to vote for. Blink them twice if they're not. And they would go through the list, and he would very carefully blink his eyes once or twice to be able to vote. I still think about that, and I think, my God, you know, there's somebody that can barely communicate and yet found it important enough to be voting. I think the combination of those tragedies, really, of my father and my brother, have always made me appreciate the fact that we've got a healthcare system that looks after everyone. Universal coverage is really important to me, making sure it's publicly funded so people can be looked after that don't have the resources. But we also have to have the courage to change the system. The system, as it stands today, is in great jeopardy. I'm reading that up to 2/3 of the people working within the system are thinking about leaving the system. And I'll tell you, that is very, very frightening when you've got an aging population, and we've just come through a pandemic, and we've got a whole bunch of people that are feeling not just burnt out, but just frustrated at the system.
When Today in BC continues, Kevin Falcon, the Bachelor is no more, and what he hopes to accomplish in his return to BC politics.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
I'm Peter McCully. Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. We're back with Kevin Falcon. Tell us, how did you know your future wife was indeed the one? And tell us about meeting your partner and becoming, as you call it, a girl dad.
Yeah, well, this is a great story in many ways. I actually got married while I was still in government, 2009. My wife Jessica and I got married, and I met her through her sister, Caroline, who was working in government. We met at the Surrey Inn in Surrey, British Columbia. It's no longer there, but it's kind of an infamous hotel. We had a political gathering going on there, and Caroline had brought her sister, and I met her, and I was immediately infatuated with her, to be honest with you. She was wonderful, and turned out that she liked doing a lot of things I liked, very outdoorsy, very much into hiking, etc. We started mountain biking together. I was already a pretty avid mountain biker, so I taught her to mountain bike, and we would go do all the great trails in the North Shore and Kamloops and throughout the province whenever we'd get a chance. We shared a love of crosswords, and it started out really as a friendship, to be honest with you, but it was a friendship that blossomed into a relationship. And as I say, we got married in 2009. Our first daughter, Josephine, was born in 2010. I'll never forget that, because that was right when the Olympics came, and I had like a 10-week or 2-week-old daughter, so I didn't participate in most of the Olympic activities for that reason. In 2012, my wife advised me that she was pregnant with our second daughter, Rose. That's when I made the decision to exit politics, because I really felt that I didn't want to be a dad that was going to be absent from my girls, especially in those critical early years. And that was the reason I decided to leave politics and announced my resignation in 2012.
So you worked in the private sector in real estate financing and investment, as I understand. Were there some lessons that you took from government to private business, or is it mostly the other way around?
There's some cross-pollination. I think the one thing that was important to me when I left politics is I didn't want to have to be working with government. So many politicians go on to become lobbyists, and they end up sort of spending their careers, working with government or trying to lobby government on behalf of business, et cetera. And that's something I just absolutely did not want to do. I wanted to have no relationship with government. working for Anthem. Anthem is a great company. Is primarily involved in the housing sector, although, we have investments in a bunch of other areas like craft breweries and technology companies and mining exploration ventures, etc. But for the most part, housing is the key thing that Anthem does. And I worked in the capital investment side of the business, so I worked a lot with our equity and debt partners. It's been great for my family. But at the end of the day, I think about my kids again, and I think about their future.
Since you were first elected in your 30s and now you're in your 50s, I'm curious to know if there are any situations that happened early in your time in government that may have caused you to change what and how you think about the issue now.
Yeah, that's such a good question, because actually, a lot of people ask me that. Has Kevin Falcon changed? I was known as a pretty hard-driving minister, get things done and very committed to making things happen. There has been some change. I think change is inevitable, and it's probably a good thing. My principles have not changed, but my values have. And I think that comes from having two young girls who are now 12 and 9 and looking at the world through their lens and realizing that we've got an obligation to try and make this world better. I think it also comes from the fact that I've spent the better part of the last decade on the board of some charities, including the Canucks Hospice Foundation, which is a house for kids with terminal illnesses. I spent better part of a decade on the Street to Home Foundation, which is helping homelessness and those that are struggling with mental health and addiction. All of those things, I think, have informed me on the importance of making change, and also really, I think, having a greater awareness of those that struggle, those that haven't got the breaks, and the importance of making sure that we find ways to, help them too, so that everyone can have the opportunity that exists in British Columbia. I want this to be an opportunity culture where if you work hard, you get the success you deserve. We just have to make sure that government doesn't put the kind of roadblocks and barriers in the way to frustrate people that are trying to get ahead.
So along that same vein, what message do you have for young people today concerned about their ability to afford a home in the future?
I want to make sure that we can provide a pathway for young people to get into housing in BC. And I've got a lot to say about this, and I'll be saying more in the months to come. But suffice to say that there's two elements that are important. One is you have to look at the cost of housing through the eyes of a first-time buyer. I want to make sure that we look at all the costs that are imposed in government. And remember, 25% of the cost of every new home today is all taxes. It's, GST, it's PST, it's property transfer tax, it's local government put on a bunch of costs too, called community amenity contributions, development cost charges, public art charges. Go through the list, and it's very extensive. And that represents 25% of the value of every new home that's sold. So we have to look at all those costs that are imposed by government through the lens of a first-time buyer and say, what can we strip out of there so that young people can have a credible chance to get into their first house?
In the past, you've been a proponent of smaller government, less red tape, as you just said. Is there more to be done there? And if so, can you do it without downloading on municipalities? You
sure can. This is something that I think is very important today, especially when you look around and you realize affordability is such an issue. We've got the highest housing prices we've ever seen. We've got the highest gas prices in North America. We've got exploding costs in grocery prices. We've got costs going up everywhere. BC now has the highest personal income tax rates in North America. We have to look at British Columbians and how most, frankly, families struggle trying to raise their kids, pay their mortgages, if they're so fortunate to have one, fill up their cars and get their kids to soccer practices and all the other things that families need to do. It's very, very tough today. And I think it's important to have a government that thinks about affordability. How do we keep the costs down? What you want to do is you want to encourage people to be willing to pay taxes. We have to understand that setting the table is important, making it attractive to families, making it attractive to investment, making it attractive to those that are trying to start up businesses and build their businesses so that a small business can become a big business. You've got to make sure you get the tax and regulatory regime right.
Well, you certainly have not lost your passion for any of the subjects you've talked about today. And so my question is, how do we as a society attract more quality candidates into political life for any party?
This is such an important question, maybe the most important question, because if I'm totally honest with you, Peter, going into public life doesn't make a lot of sense for most people. I'm going to be out recruiting candidates, women in particular, and I have to be honest with them and tell them that it's going to be tough too. There's, a lot of trolls out there on social media. What I'd like to see is a system where we have an ability to force the unmasking of these people who use the anonymity of being online to go after people in public life. And journalists too, by the way. It's very, very common, and that journalists, especially female journalists, feel the sting of this kind of nonsense every day. So that bothers me because I think to encourage good people to run for office, and I mean good people where it's genuinely a sacrifice. I'm talking about trying to encourage a lot of really good people that would normally say, are you kidding? There's not a chance I would consider that. But it is important. Public life and making these contributions is really important. I'm doing it for my kids' generation. I'm doing it because I really believe that we have to encourage people that hopefully have the skill sets to step forward and make a contribution to public life. Because if we don't get good people willing to do that anymore, we're going to end up with the B team. And when you get the B team running things, you get B team results. And I want to make sure that we can still get good A-team type characters to run for office. But it'll be tough because I know I have to be honest with people to tell them that there are a lot of downsides to being in public life too. But it's still worth doing, I would argue. It is still worth doing. At the end of the day, Peter, I always remind people, in spite of all our challenges, and there are many, we do live in the greatest province, in the greatest country in the world, and we can never forget that. But we've all got to do our bit to help make sure it stays this way.
I'd like to thank Kevin Falcon for joining us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.